İlber Ortaylı, Ottoman Studies. Historiography. Basic trends in Ottoman Turkish historiography. Ottoman chronicles, whether written anonymously or by known authors, have a common characteristic. Almost all of the chronicles which describe the 14th century were produced during the second half of the 15th century. Moreover, the contents have many characteristics in common. Those chronicles exalt the era of the foundation and the following century and a half of an empire which had reached its zenith by mid-15th century. Further, the chronicles reflect the warrior and romantic spirit of the founding days. This approach, while nurturing the 15th century imperial ideology of consolidating the empire, somewhat misled both Turkish and foreign modern Ottoman historians. After Paul Wittek's study, it has become very fashionable to account for the foundation and rise of the Ottoman Empire with the Gaza, holy war, factor. At the same time, anonymous Ottoman chronicles constantly praise the fact that the warriors fought on an equal position with a spirit of equality. They also emphasize a tribal spirit and the Turkoman tradition whereby even the booty was shared equitably between the warriors. But was this really the case? Modern historians who do not consult other sources of the period have also accepted the theory of equally shared booty. Although Professors Fuat Koprulu and Halil İncalik studied the state traditions of the Seljuk state and approached the issue in a critical manner, these authors, too, have not consulted contemporary Byzantine and Slavic sources of the late 14th century. The early periods of Ottoman history are written in a categorized way, depending on the sources utilized. Two of the earliest Ottoman chronicles, Ashik Pasha's Sade and Nejri, did not witness the events they related. A source which both chronicles claimed to have consulted, the Yahshi Faki Chronicle, is lost to modern historians. Likewise, the prospect that literary historians may be able to identify the sources of oral traditions that anonymous historians relied on does not seem promising. One point needs to be emphasized here. Although at a first glance it looks as if these chronicles differ in their worldview, they basically utilize the same concepts. All these chronicles favor certain legends and myths in order to justify the legitimacy of the Ottoman dynasty and the charismatic nature of some of the sultans. However, the origins of these myths and legends are debatable. Some of their roots in ancient Persia and the Middle East, and some are of ancient Turkic origin. For instance, the conquest of Aidos castle, which involves a love story between Abdurrahman an Ghazi and the Byzantine lord's daughter, is somehow linked with the Ottoman success. The story almost reads like Rapunzel and can be in Iranian and Seljuk tales. Interestingly enough, such legends and figures are sometimes misleading and are an impediment to a healthy synthesis of Ottoman history. Ashik Pajahzadeh relates the story of the Ottoman passage through the Dardanelles and its subsequent conquest of Gallipoli as if the process had been accomplished by Suleiman Pasha and the Ghazis simply crossing across the straits on rafts. This approach remained a historiographical motive under Professor İnançlık, until Professor İnançlık corrected the version and his historical and topographical study of Gallipoli. However, the issue has not yet been definitely resolved, and in this author's point of view, the Italian city-state archives and late Byzant studies may shed further light on the topic. The context of chronicles which describe the first Ottoman administrative organization is even more interesting. In fact, they have provided sources for speculation in social history research. One example of administrative history being the first taxation in the Ottoman state, and the establishment of a treasury and accounting system. Anonymous chroniclers mention that someone from the Germian advised Osman Ghazi to impose a bazaar tax, but that the Sultan was offended by this advice. Other sources indicate that when Osman Ghazi was convinced that this taxation was necessary, he did not hesitate to impose it. Some historical accounts, especially anonymous chroniclers, claim that the viziers Jandrali, Halil, and Karamanli Turk Rustem Pasas introduced the system of treasury and tax accounting, and that those two malicious men caused sedition in the society of the time. Obviously, rumors of this kind led certain writers to build a colorful interpretation around concepts such as feudalism, anti-feudalism, tribal democracy. In fact, as Fuat Koprulu and some other historians who were familiar with the Middle Eastern state structure observed, the Ottoman tax system was adopted from the Seljuk state. When a treasury was established, it followed that the state would claim a portion of the war booty, and naturally that the Ghazi class would react to such a loss, of privilege. However, the fact that this negative attitude and reaction to what happened in the 14th century carried over the second half of the 15th century is a curious matter and deserves further research. Some of the 15th century historians, poetic sources such as Dusturn-e Enveri and the Iskendarme of Ahmedi and Yahi Faki, chronicles written in the early 15th century but known to us only in fragments as related by earlier historians, do not give us clues to explain these problematic issues. Both in anonymous chronicles and in the Ashbihar Neshri and Oruç Bey chronicles, there are interpretations which go against the Gaza perspective but at the same time offer unanimous support for the consolidation of the dynasty. In conclusion, the context of the chronicles poses a difficult problem when we try to classify them ideologically. Also belittle the Turkomans and extend this attitude to other Anatolian beyliks such as the Karaman. Though they distinguish the Ottoman beylik from other disparaged Turkomans. Curiously, we come across passages in the chronicles which described Bayezid I as immature and ambitious during the war between Tamerlan and Bayezid. In short, it is very difficult to interpret the early periods of Ottoman history ideologically through studying the chronicles. It is mainly possible of this that modern historiography makes wrong interpretations. Both the anonymous 17th century chronicles and those which bear the signature of the author present some different interpretations. For example, as against the works of contemporary with Mehmed II, Tursunbek and Kritovulos history, there are anonymous folk chronicles such as Mahmud Pasha, Legend Kabikman, which are compiled during that century and copied over and over again by Medres students in later centuries. In these narratives, Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha, a Christian recruit who was executed by Mehmed II, is not only praised, but miracles are attributed to him, and his knowledge as well as his virtues as a statesman are exalted in a highly exaggerated state. This points to the fact that Mehmed, the conqueror, who is glorified by modern historians, was not that popular among some classes of the 15th century society. This dislike stemmed from his despotic militarism, the deportations from Anatolia to newly conquered territories, and the confiscation of the Waqf and other properties in the name of the state. Consequently, a statesman whom Mehmed had executed was glorified as a saint in the Mahmud Pasha narratives. This brings us to an important topic. What was the philosophical foundation of Ottoman historiography before the 19th century historian Ahmed Secvet Pasha? What norm did these earlier historians use? The question appears both complicated and simple. If we compare the Ottoman historians with their Western counterparts and Ibn Khaldun, the greatest historian of Islam, it seems quite easy to evaluate and judge Ottoman historiography. And a colorful picture emerges when it is approached from the methodological point of view. Ottoman historiography was established by unusual people who were different from what would be expected of a traditional society. A 17th century historian, Ibrahim Pechevi, had even read the works of the Hungarian historian István Pechevi, who spoke German and Hungarian, refers to the history of the Golden Horde and even to that of the Ukrainian Cossacks and the Kipchak steppe while discussing the Crimean Khans. Ottoman chronicles look like the traditional histories because they have a sense of world histories, which starts with Adam and Noah. But unlike traditional histories, some of the chronicles are also concerned with the problem of identity, when the authors claimed that the Turks originated from Yafet. From the viewpoint of language, Hacı Saadeddin is one example of a 17th century historian who enriched the Turkish language by using Persian stylistics in his work. Consequently, a Neo-Persian style was introduced to Turkish historiography, which was almost like the Hellenistic stylistics of Anna Komnene and her 10th century contemporaries. This brings us to the question of the philosophy of history. In 17th century, Naima and Selanik'i discussed the disruption of order in the state structure and society and proposed the remedy of restoring the 16th century institutions of Suleiman the Magnificent era. Generally speaking, Ottoman historians, under the influence of the ancient Persian tradition of writing and the advice to the sultans, and this was the case with the 16th century historian Kinalizade. According to him, a just government is the source of peace and wealth. The concept of predestination in history is non-existent in this case. Besides, no, quote, factum est, end quote, types of approach or methodology as it used by one of the early Christian historians, as Scribnanus does. Ottoman historians treat the concept of the state as the eternal state. In addition, Ottoman historians are not familiar either with Ibn Khaldun or with a sociological approach to history of the kind of Ibn Khaldun he used. In fact, Ibn Khaldun was not understood and his methodology was not used or preferred even by a 19th century historian like Ahmet Cevdet Pasha, who translated Ibn Khaldun's work impeccably into Turkish. Consequently, Ottoman historiography never took into consideration either the duality between theory and practice or the search for bridging the gap between the two. Yet, it is very fortunate that the late Ottoman historians did not adopt a Voltairean or Hegelian teleological methodology as did the 19th century Slavic historians. One of the major conditions for the development of any historiography is the observation of world history as well as of other peoples and cultures. This has been an accepted fact since Herodotus, but it appears that until the 19th century, the Ottoman chronicles which fulfill these basic conditions are exceptional and unsatisfactory. And yet, during the age of classical Islam, Arab and Persian historians took world history into consideration. In the 11th century, Shah Hamad al-Andalusi classified the people who were useful to civilization in his Kitab Tarikh Umman as Egyptians, Persians, Romans, Greeks, Jews, Indians, and Arabs. He is aware of the histories of cultures in his classification. Al-Andalusi qualifies other peoples as underdeveloped because of the geographical and other conditions. He considers the Chinese and the Turks as possessing practical intelligence, but as two peoples who had no direct impact on the development of civilization. Civilization, in Andalusi's estimation, geographically belonged to the Mediterranean basis. Ibn Khaldun, in his Introduction to History, wrote a rich universal history of the era. In fact, he even goes further than rabbinical sources, which do not mention Flavius Joseph Iosipon, and he describes the Masada War and the Jewish history of the Roman period. The Persian historian Residuddin of the Ikhanid period consulted very interesting sources to write a world history. During the classical Ottoman period, Ottoman historians did not give proof of similar capabilities. In the 17th century, Hezafren Hüseyin Efendi attempted to write a universal history because he knew Latin and Greek, and finished the work in 1673. European diplomats such as Antoine Galland and L.F. Marsigli, his contemporaries, speak highly of him. Khatib Çelebi, too, was a product of the 17th century Ottoman intelligentsia, and was familiar with universal history, geography, the science, besides knowing Greek. But these examples are exceptions to the rule. In the 18th century, Ottoman historiography assumed an interesting practical function. The growth of Russia and the loss of a Muslim Turkic land such as the Crimean Khanate caused the historians to focus on a new motif, i.e., the Caliphate. Vasif-i Enderuni claimed that Selim I assumed the Caliphate in 1517 from the Mamluks in Egypt. It is difficult to corroborate a historical event of this kind. Though they were the servants and the protectors of the Hejaz, the Ottoman sultans rarely resorted to the title of Caliph until the 19th century. It was only on the late 18th century that the Caliphate was introduced to historical writings as a tool of diplomacy to be used in Muslim lands which had been conquered by the Christians. Hence, the Caliphate was described as a universal political religious Caesaro-Papist institution. The fiction of the Caliphate transferred to the Ottoman Sultan in a ceremony which was developed in the 18th century chronicles continued in the 19th and even in the 20th century textbooks. But the conqueror sultans of the 16th century paid no attention to a ceremony or a protocol of that kind. In the 18th century, there was a remarkable change in the Ottoman outlook on Europe and Russia in historiography and in ambassadorial reports. Basically, the historiography followed the change in outlook of the new information which came through an ambassadorial reports which described foreign lands. In the Ottoman Empire, knowledge about foreign lands was not acquired through a geographical, historical, or philological studies, any more than through military or strategic research. Information was obtained in a pragmatic way, i.e., through the observations of the envoys sent to Europe, and their reports inevitably affected the historiography. By the 19th century, Ottoman historians began to discover the histories of Europe through translated works as well as the geography and history of the empire's foremost enemy, Russia. And there are some interesting interpretations of Russian history. Despite falsifications, the 19th century Ottoman historiography offers attractive evaluations of European and Russian history. In the course of one century, Ottoman historiography went through a curious transformation concerning the evaluation of Petrine Russia and its reforms. Conservative official Ottoman historiography changed within one century of Petrine Russia. At the same time, Peter Great's death was recorded by Rashir Effendi, the official chronicle of the Ottoman states, in the following words, quote, "The Muscovite Tsar Peter is dead. His corpse was left lying in some quiet corner. He had tried to impose crazy new fashions on his people. End quote. And Mehmed Aga, an Ottoman ambassador who had visited Petrine Russian at the time, had gone so far as to heap scorn on a parade organized by the emperor and on European protocol, used there with the expression the Tsar's clownings. Another Ottoman ambassador, Shehdi Effendi, left the following description of an opera he attended in 1757 at the invitation of Empress Elizabeth. Quote, "The singers and instrumentalists stroked their instruments in a strange fashion, shouting according to certain modes in their own language." End quote. By 1794, however, the ambassador at the court of Catherine II, Mustafa Rashi Pasha, left us detailed information concerning the way of life and the administrative and military organization of the period, expressing great admiration. Apparently, this change in attitude occurred around the time of the signing of the Küçük-Kayarna Treaty. In the 19th century, Ottoman thought and historiography, Peter was no longer the mad, but the great. Thus, an official book by an unknown writer, probably a dragoman at the Sublime Porte, with a significant title, The History of Peter the Great, was printed right at the outbreak of the Crimean War. Cevdet Pasha, too, spoke of Petrine Russian and Peter's reform with unmistakable praise in his famous history. Quote, "The Russians had never had a powerful state or great renown. Now they rule 1/9 of the world. The real founder of the state is Peter the Great." End quote. While giving insistent credit to the myth of the testament of Peter the Great, or deliberately falsifying this testament to provoke the anti-Russian attitude of the Ottoman Turkish intellectual circles, this same author makes the following interesting comparison between the reforms of Peter and Mahmud II in his correspondence with Sadullah Pasha, the Ottoman ambassador in Vienna. Quote, "The political organization of the two states is essentially similar and parallel." End quote. He further believes that, quote, "In England, reforms were initiated by the gentry, that is, the upper class, and it was this that led to the creation of a constitutional monarchy. Whereas in France, the upper class proved incapable of doing the same, so the initiative came from below, and they resulted in a republic." End quote. To this, he then adds, quote, "Ottoman as well as Russian reforms were embarked upon by the crown. Even the dissolution of the Janissaries resembles the dissolution of the Strelitsky, with the difference that whereas Janissaries had been a cancer in the very heart of our Sublime Porte, the Strelitsky had been a tumor on Russia's back. Here, once the Janissaries were dispersed, continuous reforms in every administrative department became inevitable. But there, in Russia, a vacuum became apparent only in the military field, and therefore Russian recovery was quickly completed. We do not possess cadres with the necessary courage and will. Peter was very determined, and he acquired further learning in Europe. When he removed the Strelitsky, he knew what he was doing, and how he was going to replace them. Sultan Mahmud was also a determined ruler, but he had not seen and would not see Europe. Our statesmen were not endowed with sufficient learning and determination." End quote. It should be pointed out that instead of focusing on the personalities of Ottoman statesmen, Ahmed Cevdet Pasha could have dwelt on the fact that the Ottoman reforms were a full century late in coming. Nevertheless, the comments revealed him to be a serious historian who was able to approach the Russian reforms analytically. Later Ottoman historiography was both sincere and naive in its interpretation of Islamic history and institutions, with a view to supporting the concept of constitutional monarchy. In the late 19th century, historians claim, by stretching the evidence, that the Mashvara consultation in Islamic history equaled parliamentarism. In conclusion, demystification was not only difficult to apply and a latecomer to Ottoman Turkish historiography, but its mission is still incomplete.